Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today we're on an apologetics seasonal episode. We're answering the question, who are you really? And our guest today is Josh Rasmussen. He is written on this question, this topic, and he's going to really help us with this deep question, deep philosophical and maybe theological question that we have with this. Who are we? And so we'll jump here into this episode here in a moment. I'll let Peter further introduce him, but first, remind you guys about our show notes. You'll find some links and information, link to IVP, as well as some other information about how to find Josh and his works, as well as a link to find how to find a close Reformed or confessional church near your area, and just basic information on how to find myself, Nick, or Peter, or both of us on the show and communicate with us through Twitter, Instagram. You can find these conversations via video on YouTube. You can email us at guiltgracepod@gmail.com. And then just more basic information, housekeeping stuff, and of course, our amazing bridge builder sponsors like Logos Bible Software. You hear more information from. So let's jump into this episode. Who are you really? And I'll let Peter further introduce Josh Rasmussen today.
Yeah, we got Dr. Josh Rasmussen is professor, associate professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University. If you know my alma mater, we're bitter rivals. So Biola and Azusa are bitter rivals, but we'll leave that for another day. He's the author of How Reason Can Lead to God, Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, and The Bridge of Reason, co-authored Necessary Existence, and Is God the Best Explanation of Things? A dialogue and a co-editor of a new theist perspective response to new atheists. It's a pleasure having you on.
Thank you. It's really great to be with you. Appreciate it.
Of course, yeah. So what's it like? I know you went to Biola after your undergrad, and now you're teaching it at our bitterest rivals that we used to call like pagans.
Yeah, that's it. Right.
College.
Yeah. So I have a little bit of blood from both schools, I guess. So it's great. I like both schools and I appreciate both, and I'm internally contradictory, I guess.
That's great. So maybe to further introduce yourself to our listeners who may not know who you are, maybe provide a brief little bio of yourself, your background, and what you do.
Okay. So most important thing is I like mint chocolate chip ice cream, Breyers.
Wow. Okay.
And that's,
you and my wife would get along really well.
Yeah, good. And after that, the second most important thing is that I'm a person. And I have that in common with you, I believe.
That's right.
This is the subject of my latest inquiry, the subject of what we're going to be talking about.
Yep.
And it's related to my work as a philosopher, because one of the things that I'm just very passionate about is just trying to understand things as far as I can.
Mm-hmm.
I just get very curious, like Nick was telling me before the show, about how he'll be driving somewhere just sort of wondering about something, about his mind or about the world or something. So that's exactly how I am. And ever since I was a kid, I would be just very curious. And once I discovered there's a profession you could do this for a living to try to get insights about things, there's just no turning back. So my area of work is kind of focused on first existence. So kind of my first set of publications were on whether there's a kind of element of existence that has a necessity to it. It can't be broken or fall apart or anything. It can't even fail to be a kind of necessary existence. And then that related to some work about the foundations of everything, of all of reality. And then actually that work has led to my most recent project on consciousness and on persons, which we'll be talking about today, because one of the questions that I've been thinking about is, how is our existence related to fundamental existence? You know, how could we even come to exist at all? How can reality give rise to beings like us who can think and feel, have a conversation like this? So that's a bit about who I am and what I'm interested in.
So those are like kind of small questions to ask yourself.
Just small ones, yeah.
Yeah, just who am I? What am I doing here?
Yeah. So my goal, I always have like big goals, you know, and then I feel like, hey, let's just go for it. And I tease my students sometimes because every once in a while, I will see a group of students outside a classroom. They all think the door is locked. And every once in a while, it's not locked, but they believe it's locked because somebody else believes it's locked. And then
Oh,
I
yeah.
just teased them about that.
Like groupthink. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think that one of the things I want to try to understand is like, if everybody's kind of going this way and they say, hey, you can't answer this question, that's too big. Well, let me just go try. And if I fail trying, then maybe I've learned something in the process.
That's awesome.
Maybe I'll find out the door was locked. Maybe I'll find out, hey, that door wasn't locked. Hey guys, come over here.
That's right. Yep.
That happens sometimes.
That's true. Cool.
I had a really random memory just now tying it to consciousness is talking about your conscience and which I'm sure we'll dip into. When I was a little kid, my favorite movie as a really little kid, Disney movie, Pinocchio. And watched it over and over. If you know little kids, they'll watch movies endlessly over and over again.
If you know me, I'll watch a movie endlessly.
Oh, you and my son Leo.
The Rookie. I watched The Rookie, that like early 2000s Disney flick, like 100 times.
Wow.
You and my son Leo, that's 3 now, would get along very well.
We do get along pretty well. I don't know if
you do
noticed.
actually. You do. But anyway, with Jiminy Cricket, I was like, oh, that's a interesting aspect of, you know, talking about your conscience, be your guide, and he's a little cricket guy living in his heart and in this puppet. And so yeah, I don't know why I thought of that, but maybe this is kind of linking to some early childhood questions.
You didn't actually know this, Josh, but you're our psychologist right now. We're just going through our early childhood.
I'm wondering, you know, maybe it's related to, you know, deep childhood questions you have about the nature of the conscience. You know, should you be trusting your own conscience? What is that?
Right.
What is that? Is it particles in your brain? You know, what was that voice in your head?
Well, there's a reason why they made Jiminy Cricket who he was, and if you watch the new Pinocchio movie,
oh, that's right. There's a new live action.
There's 2 new ones. That either way, there's one where he's like living literally in where his heart is. Anyway. So anyway, let's get back to you, not me. What first got you researching the nature of consciousness and its being, and its beginning?
Yeah, so you got me thinking about beings inside of myself. And actually in the book, I do talk about this sort of problem about how you can demarcate yourself out of a cloud of particles. And there are some ways of answering the question, how do you demarcate yourself out of a cloud of particles, where it leads to this problem of too many persons, because there's too many particles that function like a person. And so you get little persons inside of big persons. You know, I mean, like if you can survive the loss of some fingernails or something, or some atoms, it's like, well, you're shrinking down to a particle cloud that was already there, but wasn't a person before, but is a person now, maybe, right? So anyway, you're having me think about that. We can come back to that sort of thing. But what got me interested in this topic was, in a way, I've always kind of been interested in kind of the nature of who we are. I mean, it's just kind of one of the philosophical topics. But more recently, people have been emailing me these questions about whether fundamental reality would have a kind of consciousness to it. And they wanted to know, you know, what I thought about that. And when I was in graduate school, I took a number of different courses on the nature of the mind. Some people listening to this may know of Jaegwon Kim. He's a philosopher of mind, very well known in the field for his work. He's got a book called Physicalism, or Something Near Enough, and he articulates a theory of consciousness in terms of, in physicalist terms. But there's a reason why the title of the book is Or Something Near Enough, because there are aspects of consciousness that he wants to give an account of, but that account is not going to be exhausted in his terms by just third person physics. And so I took a course with him, and that was very fascinating. I took a couple courses from JP Moreland from Biola.
Oh yeah, he's a big guy at Biola.
Yeah, and then also from Alvin Plantinga. Took a course with him. Course with a philosopher of mind named Robert Hanna, another course in philosophy of mind with Michael Tooley. That was more on perception. And so I kind of just kept taking these courses on the mind and on consciousness. I began to then contribute to the field some of my own ideas. And this was kind of in the background of my work, because my early work was more on fundamental existence. But in the background, I've been thinking about the mind. And really, I think probably what caused me to decide, I'm going to write a book on this, was when I was on a podcast. I think it was Capturing Christianity, and we were talking about consciousness. And what I discovered from the Q&A from the audience and from the conversation was that there's a very big divide or gulf between maybe popular impressions about the field of the mind or consciousness, the ways people are framing the questions, the impressions people have in the popular sphere is so much different than the impressions that I get in the field, working with philosophers, going to conferences, attending talks, giving talks of my own, contributing to the field. And I feel like there's been a lot of progress in the field, but then there's also a lot of kind of new things going on in relation to some of the empirical sciences. And so it just kind of opened it up, and I was like, I need to revisit this topic, study this in more depth, and write about it. So I would say that's kind of what opened it up for me, just seeing that gap between kind of popular discussions and a lot of developments I feel like that are going on behind the scenes that are not really well understood. And I wanted to give readers sort of tools that they can navigate these questions for themselves, and understand things by their own lights.
Yeah, so that's leads me into this question, because this book we're talking about now, Who Are You Really, which is your forthcoming one that'll come out about a month and a half after this interview comes out. But I'm gonna call it what it is. It's a tour de force. It's the best one because it's one of the only ones I've read on the mind. So it's one of the best, or the best.
The best of that list.
Exactly. Yeah. But it really is really good, because it goes into because it's introspective, and we've talked about that a little bit, and we'll dig into this more, into the nature of humanity and first person beings. And you've already talked about third person and first person. Maybe if you want to describe that and the problem of defining how that might have come about. Like, how do you know that you are a first person? How do you know that you have these thoughts? How do you know these things? So to begin with, what is so unique about a human being? What is first person? Why can humans have first person things versus what's a third person thing compared to basically anything else you see in this world that's not a human?
Yeah. So I think of a first person thing as something that depends on somebody's perspective. And sometimes we sort of forget that we view the world from a perspective, especially when people maybe talk about the facts, like it's a fact that the earth is round, it's not flat like a pancake. That's a fact. Well, where is that fact exactly? How do you know that fact? I would think of that fact as third person in the sense that its truth or its obtaining isn't itself tied down to a first person perspective. In other words, the earth would have its shape independently of whether or not you or I are aware of the earth. Now, this opens up other questions about whether maybe in God's mind, the earth has its shape grounded in a wider consciousness, but we can sort of set that aside for now and just point out something I think that people take for granted, which is that they view the world from a perspective. Like, so right now, people who are listening to this, you are able to hear sounds, and there's you experiencing those sounds, and those experiences of those sounds are in a perspective. There's you experiencing them from your own point of view, and that sort of point of view is not something that would be necessarily included in a purely third person description of brains, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe to dig into that a little bit further. So what you're saying, maybe to ground it for people. So first person is I'm the one thinking these things, versus third person is either something's like I'm observing something else or something else that's happening to me, versus I'm the one who's doing it. Is that like kind of help?
Yeah, first person relative to me would be that it's my thoughts, my feelings, my perspective, versus something that would be able to exist apart from my perspective, or anybody's perspective, just exists out there. And there are questions here about how the first person and third person even go together, but sort of minimally start with your own point of view, think about how things seem to you from your perspective, And then there's just this further question about how reality can include anything that has a first person perspective. How do perspectives exist in the first place?
So yeah, I told you that I'm kind of weird, right? So I have I've thought about this before, actually. And so do you think is it kind of like this? Our self-awareness is where kind of objective and subjective reality meets, and where we have a, you know, from our soul within a measurable space which we live in, which is just time. You know what I mean? So does that sound completely weird?
I like it. But so Nick, forgive me for being a philosopher. What do you mean by soul here in this context?
Ooh, good. Soul would be our the created awareness from God that's given to us, that makes us more than just skin and bones and cells, or not even cells because those are living too, but just body mass. Like it's actual the spark that's in us that God made, you know.
Yeah.
And there is a, when we talk about self-awareness, I feel like we're viewing objective reality, which is more of whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, it is what it is, and it's God's nature. And also our perspective, which is subjective.
Yeah.
So, and then also we live in space and time as matter, right? So we live in a measurable space, which God lives outside of time and space, but we live inside creation, which is time and space. And even space is measurable. So it's almost like, and time, even time is measurable, I meant. So
yeah.
I don't know if I was
I think I was about to say, Josh, he talks about this in his book, because he talks
Really?
about your perspective on reality, whether you know which perspective it is, whether you can rely on your perspective.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Nick, I really like how you put that, because you're talking about how the objective and the subjective could kind of come together.
Yeah.
In your own awareness. Like your awareness is subjective because it's an aspect of you, a subject. But it can grab onto things that are external to you. And in that sense, they're objective, at least in the sense that they don't depend on your consciousness or your perspective to exist. Now, it's tricky because there's a bigger question about how anything like us can exist at all. And part of my project is to see if we can understand our existence in terms of something that can kind of unify all of us, so all of our consciousness, as well as unify the world itself. And so there's a weird way in which I'm going to kind of come back to your thought about how the objective and the subjective can sort of come together in a self. Because I end up sort of arguing for something similar in my book, that subjectivity and objectivity, even of the external world, come together in a fundamental self. And by the way, the term soul, I try not to use that word, except
I was about to say, you use it like maybe once or twice that I can think of.
Yeah, I do use it, but it's kind of like, here's something else that I've defined in terms of yourself. If you want to use the term soul to apply to that, I think that's going to fit with what you're talking about, Nick, because the idea is that the self is something that can animate your body. There's more to your body. There's more to you than just the molecules in motion. There's something else, you know, as you put it, like a spark. Well, what is that spark? I end up making the argument that there's a self that's actually very familiar, that you can know it through self-awareness, a kind of direct acquaintance with yourself. And it's actually, it's almost like so familiar that it's hard to talk about it, because either somebody wants a definition, maybe in terms of the brain or something, and we could talk about challenges with that definition, or they're going to want something that's going to fill in more information. But it's like one of those things that's very familiar. Like you wake up aware of yourself, like here I am. You can have dreams, you could be aware of yourself in your dreams, but I do think that there is that kind of self, and that kind of provides an anchor between the subjective and the objective.
That's cool. Yeah. And somebody physically that's missing body parts or deformed or was born without a body.
Still has a self. Yeah.
They're just as human as we are, that has all our body parts.
Which actually, again, Josh talks about in his book that like you can cut off a fingernail, you can cut off a finger, cut off an arm, but you still have the self. So it must not be totally located in that one place. So like, where is it? And
or what is it? You know, maybe it's not the
Yeah.
kind of thing that has a location. I mean, on Twitter, I was entering this conversation because I had this quote from an author about, well, this is actually from what you guys were talking about, from this book on the Sapiens book. And I had this quote out of there about trying to locate the soul in a biological system. And so I just I shared that on Twitter to kind of get some reactions. And somebody asked this question like, well, you know, what were the scientists expecting to find if they did find the soul? And then somebody said, you know, maybe it'd be like a blue glob or something like this. Right. And I thought it would be green, right? Why blue? Because we have these assumptions, right, about what we're going to be finding. But, you know, maybe what you are isn't even the kind of thing that has a color fundamentally, or even a shape. And so we try to sort of locate the soul inside the body, but maybe that's because we're so accustomed to thinking of things in terms of shape and space. But that, you know, if you have a dream and you have in your dream a kind of spatial structure where you can look over here to the side and start to move in your dream, and you say, well, that's not real space, but it has sort of this feeling of location in the dream. But are you in the dream as a spatial image? It's like, well, no, you're the one having the dream. You're like the backdrop animating the dream, right? And I think there's something like that with respect to our bodies. It's like our bodies represent us in a spatial way. But that doesn't mean that we are fundamentally ourselves spatial. I mean, in fact, if we're in the image of God, and if God is not fundamentally spatial, as Nick was describing God as transcending time and space as well, you know, perhaps if we are in the image of God, that could imply that our nature is also transcendent to at least space. Although, I mean, this opens up another controversy. I do think there's a sense in which we can experience time in connection with a relationship with a dynamic with God, you know, but even then God's not confined by the temporal order in that sense. And so maybe there's a way in which we aren't either. You know, in a deep way, like in a most fundamental way. People in the NDE experiences, near-death experiences, sometimes talk about this feeling that they weren't really in time, you know, and I'm not sure what they mean by that, but maybe they're pointing to something that's like more fundamental than time itself and space itself. And maybe maybe our nature is more deeply rooted than these other concepts.
It's almost like the most original source of existence is outside of time.
Yeah.
Because that was there first, and then God
created... it wasn't even there first, because if you say there first, then you're assuming time. So it's like, how do you actually relate? How do you actually relate this divine being to time if you can't relate him to time, because then that time bounds him?
Exactly.
It was already there, already as a temporal notion.
Exactly.
Right. It's hard to even talk about these things. I mean, just very, very briefly, my preferred model would be that time flows out of change and events. And so the source of change, the source of events is not temporal prior. This is not a temporal priority, but it's an explanatory priority. Explanatorily prior to the first event, the source is not temporal, but then with that first event, there's time. And that's why there is time. And, you know, maybe there's something similar about our own existence, that most fundamentally we exist prior to spatial categories, perhaps even temporal categories.
It sounds, before next question, I don't know if you've read, I mean, I'm assuming you've read them. It sounds a hair like Augustine's kind of doctrine of creation, because he doesn't like the time element of creation. He's like, I can't imagine anything besides instantaneous, whenever it happened, instantaneous creation, because I can't bind God to this time thing. So I have to not even put him before, but like he has to speak it. And I'm not saying he's before or after. He's like, he has to say something for it to do something. But I think he's kind of wrestling with the time question too.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely there's similarities there for sure.
And time is how we make sense of things, because if you think about it, the past is just always memory. It's just stuff that's happened. We can't go physically back to it. We can't manifest the past. We are always just presently present in the now. Like you can't just escape the present. And then the future is just fantasizing about the future, thinking about it. Of course, biblically, there's promises and prophecies and what's to happen for hope that's going to happen in the future. And we know that's going to happen because God doesn't lie and it's going to happen. But we are always living in time and space that God created just as of right now.
Yeah,
Right
I
now.
100% agree with that. There's something about the now that's very special, and it's different from the past and the future. And I mean, every one of these topics, divine creation, time, whether the now is privileged, every single one opens up all this controversy. And I'm actually just noticing that I like to be sort of as inclusive as I possibly can when making an argument. But here I'm kind of just putting my cards on the table, and I agree with you that, you know, I do think that there's something about the now, the present, that's privileged or very special, and it's distinct from the past and the future. And I think there's even health benefits to that, because sometimes I find that if I'm sort of living in the past or living in the future in my mind, I'm not being present, then I feel like I get scattered. And just by the way, my New Year's word for the year is to be, the word is appreciation. And the way that I'm practicing appreciation is by actually focusing on just like being present. And this is certainly related to the nature of consciousness and the nature of persons, because in the second part of the book, I talk about this question of identity through time. How can you be the same person from one moment to the next? And this is related to a puzzle, especially if you think that all there are clouds of atoms and their arrangements. Because if all there are atoms and their arrangements, there's this deep question about, well, what makes you the same person from moment to moment if atoms are, you know, you and I could be swapping our atoms in principle, and I could still exist over here. Maybe over time we swap all of our atoms. Maybe slowly my shape starts to look more like your shape, and your shape starts to look like my shape. Then do I become you? Do you become me? It seems like, it seems like if I do have self-awareness, it seems like that self-awareness gives me access to what I call first-person data. First-person data is data that I can access from my perspective directly, immediately, like that I'm thinking, that I'm feeling a certain way, and that there's me, that I'm real, and that I continue to be real. And I think that first-person data can give you a clue about your relationship to the body. In particular, I make the argument, it's not an easy argument, but I'm just going to point to it here, that in order for you to maintain your identity from moment to moment in a sea of changing atoms moving in and out, you aren't actually grounded in any particular set of atoms. In fact, I make the argument that your identity is prior to atoms. Your existence and identity is rooted in something else other than atoms. And this can also help to explain how you can make a difference in the world. Because there's this problem in the literature about agency. How can you be an agent in the world? How can you make a decision? Hey, I'm going to go cross the street right now. I'm going to go get some milk. Like, how can you do something in your mind that actually makes a difference in the physical world if everything's already completely determined by atoms or particles that are outside your control? And when I say determined, I don't mean to imply that everything in the world has to be deterministic. Even if the world proceeds by chance, okay, and things aren't completely deterministic, still, if the fundamental actors of reality are mindless atoms or quantum fields, or however you want to describe it, it's not you, something else besides you. If that's true, if it's something else pulling the strings on everything else, then you become a puppet of this sort of mindless noise, in which case you don't actually have control over anything. And some people follow the argument that way. They say the foundation of reality is mindless noise, and therefore you don't have a control over everything, anything at all. But I would flip it. I would say we actually have first-person data that we can access, including the data of forming thoughts and intentions. And then we can see, hey, there's a correlation, a connection between forming an intention to raise my hand or to count to 15 in my mind, and then subsequent actions that correspond with that intention. And I would make the argument, the best explanation of that to me is that we actually do have some power to make a difference, that we can form an intention and actually make a difference. And so therefore, if that's right, then fundamental reality isn't just mindless noise pulling all the strings.
I love it. I got a list of random questions. Peter's gonna get mad at me. Going, how about I ask some of the questions I'm supposed to ask, and then if we have time, I'm gonna. And if the audience is getting a little confused here, don't worry, guys. We're not going totally Gnostic on you. We're taking this to a certain point too. We're gonna, we still know that the body, the created being, is very important too. You know, even
we're talking about something like slightly different about the body, because we're talking about the
exactly.
How do I know that I'm different than something else versus myself?
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to emphasize what you're saying, Nick. Yeah, so I'm not saying the body's not important.
Yeah,
it's very important. There's a deep connection between me and my
just
body.
A different conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to make sure people heard. You never know. There's people listening and they're like, oh, they're getting all Gnostic.
That's the Gnostic
crazy.
heresy.
Yeah. So just throwing that out there. So I got a question here. So the first part of your book, I believe the Who Are You Really book, you discuss the nature of human beings and our senses, feelings, body. There we go. Value. One point and theme you keep coming back to is the fact that humans inherently know that we do have value. And I guess we could define what value means. And then we feel things. We feel things not even just physically, but internally, in our soul and mentally, things in our heart, because we are first person beings. So you can describe what first person is. You talked about that a little bit earlier. Third person, I know with video games, some people guys have played video games. That's how I remember, is like first person video games, like Wolfenstein 3D, or
there you go.
From yourself. Yeah.
Like
versus third person is you see the thing that you're playing.
Yeah. And then third person is more like Mario. And then beings do not have the ability to perceive things about themselves. On the surface, the answer is obvious, but as we dive further, it gets more complex. So maybe you can describe more of the first person, third person experience.
Yeah, that's good. So the way that I think about it, that term first person being, in the book, sometimes I use the term first person self. It's that reality that I think that you can be aware of when you're self-aware, and you're aware of it from your first person perspective. I liked your reference to Wolfenstein 3D, because, in these first person shooter games, you're the
same age as me, by the way, because you know what game I'm talking about.
That's a fun one.
I'm all about 007 is my era.
So you're viewing the world from your first person perspective there, which is different than viewing it sort of from a third person, sort of top down perspective. And I think that you are real. I mean, this is one of these things that it's hard to really appreciate the significance of this. Like, you may not have ever actually seen your brain. Okay. Very few people have seen their own brains. They've seen maybe pictures of other people's brains. And I mean, look, I believe that I have a brain, but my belief that I have a brain is not based on any kind of direct conscious awareness that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of axons firing or anything like this. So my belief in my brain is based on an inference that explains reports of other people's brains, and then I witness myself acting in similar ways to other people. So I think, well, probably I have a brain. Yeah. So it seems like a good explanation of the behaviors that I'm witnessing. But I would say that I do have a conscious awareness of myself thinking, myself feeling, myself wondering if I have a brain. Okay. I'm not actually wondering that, but I could. And so what this highlights to me is this concept of a first person self, which is that self that you're aware of through kind of direct first person introspective awareness. And I take a lot of time in the book to make a case for this tool of introspection, because it's pretty powerful in terms of what it can imply. Because if it can imply that there are realities that you can access directly and get information about, and those realities don't seem to fit so well into just a purely spatial characterization of a brain structure, then this tells us something about the kind of world we live in, which is our world includes, in addition to atoms and molecules in space, something else, something that you can witness more immediately. And so you mentioned value. What I think is that, I make a case for this, that you can actually be aware also of your own value. There's evidence that people are aware of their value by how they respond if you treat them as if they have no value. So if you like go online and you start, telling people that you just think they're pretty stupid, they have no value, they're everything they do is just idiotic, they might not like that. And the fact that they might not like that might be a clue that whether they have a philosophy that supports this or not. I think there's a behavior that kind of indicates that we have a kind of acquaintance with our own self-worth. I think there's a kind of immediacy of there's something significant about me. And so I try to articulate this carefully and make some distinctions in the book, but basically it comes down to using that tool of introspection to witness yourself and your own worth directly and immediately. And then if you can do that, this opens up all sorts of interesting, not only implications, but then questions about how a being like you that has value could exist. Because, just to go back to what I was talking about before, if the reality is mindless noise at the base, just particles in motion or quantum fields, or, I think it's helpful for me to like think about like sand, because it's like a visual metaphor. It's like the dust in the air is probably not thinking, it's probably not feeling. Okay. But if it were thinking and if it were feeling, it's probably not in control of its thoughts or feelings, because the sand itself is just blowing in the wind. There's forces that are, in a sense, behind the sand, making it do what it does. And so if all that we are is built up out of these more fundamental mindless actors, then it's sort of hard to see how, A, we have agency, B, how we actually have that intrinsic value, C, how there could actually be a self, like a first person self, not just third person sand, but the first person self that you witness in your own perspective. There's all sorts of interesting puzzles and questions that I think arise precisely out of what I call the mindlessness frame of reality, where the base of reality is mindless noise, you could say, or particles or whatever it is. But if instead you flip that frame around, and if you have at the base of reality some kind of mentality, that changes the game. It gives us different resources to explain how there could be beings like us who are in the image of the fundamental consciousness, that can act, that can have powers to make a difference, that can also have value, intrinsic value, because we're in the image and the likeness, or in the nature of that base reality. If it itself is a first person self, if it itself has consciousness, okay, then it has value. And then we can make the argument that it could have resources to produce beings after its own kind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's good. It's saying that just because something exists doesn't mean that it's alive, because
or alive in the same way that we are.
Yeah, that sounds really obvious, but think of, like you were talking about dust. We could talk about just innate objects. They don't even know they're there. They're just there floating, and they're just in space and time, but they're part of God's creation, but they have no self-awareness. They're not alive at all. Yeah, but they're only there. They only exist because whether we see them or not, they exist.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, even images in your own mind don't themselves have self-awareness. Like if you have an image of a person in your mind and you're dreaming, that image isn't itself alive. It's rather a content of consciousness of someone who is alive.
Well, that's the Matrix.
It's related to this because now this is going farther than is necessary for the purposes of my book, but I've been my mind has been transitioning to this view that the actual material world is itself contents of a more fundamental mind. And this seems to fit with my understanding of what a number of different scientists are saying about the nature of the physical matter, like what is matter, but it also fits very well with just an analysis, or a kind of philosophical analysis that explains the data available. And the idea here is that there are things that are not themselves conscious, they're not themselves alive, like images in your mind. If you think of the number two in your mind is not conscious, it's not alive, okay? But it still exists as a content of your mind. And so I would make the argument that the material world is actually that way too. It exists in the content of mentality, whether that be God's mind or our minds in a way that makes it so that there's a perspectival nature to matter. There are other ways we could flesh this out, but perhaps a simple way to think about it is to imagine that there's this foundational substance that has the power of consciousness, and it also has the power to produce images and spatial structures within its mind in the same way that we can produce images and thoughts and structures in our own minds.
Yeah. So, and what you said, I'm going to combine a couple questions that I think it works better with this, based off what you just said. And because you made a couple of things where first person, third person, consciousness, non-conscious, and the thoughts and feelings. And maybe you can flesh out for our audience, because you've said multiple times, like, okay, how do you get from like a non-mindful material thing to a mindful material thing?
Yeah.
And we were both talking about a book that we've been reading, the Sapiens book. And I mean, this has been a debate, I'm sure, with philosophers for forever. So maybe if you can just describe to our audience, like what is that kind of tension on, like, how can what you and I have that allows us to look in the world from our own perspective, how can that exist if that, like, is it possible that that something that didn't have that created what we have, or does it require something else different?
Yeah, so this takes us back to, I call this a construction problem, but actually I think there are lots of different construction problems. So think again about just that mindless scatter of atoms. And the question is, how can you take these mindless atoms and organize them into a conscious being who can think, feel, have intrinsic value, can make a difference in the world, can have to actually be a first person self, can persist through time and be the same self, even as its particles, the particles of its body are swapped and replaced out. And what I do in the book is I try to show how each of these different features of ourselves that we can sort of witness through introspective awareness, our ability to think, our ability to feel, or having that intrinsic value, each one of those creates a separate construction problem. And I make the argument that you need the right kind of materials. Like some materials just can never produce a conscious being. Like you can never roll rocks against a wall and then produce a first person self or a thought or a feeling. And I make the argument that if you can understand what the nature of thoughts are through introspection, then you can start to see that there's a incongruence between the natures. It's sort of like taking a bunch of numbers and then adding them up. Take all the prime numbers, add them up, and produce a prime minister. It's like, well, that's like you can't do that. It's wrong. Numbers are the wrong material.
Yep.
Yeah, you can't have an imaginary character in your mind and then roll it into a leaf, and you can't take leaves and roll them into a first person conscious being, So I go through in detail, and in fact, actually I have a whole chapter on thoughts, and I derive what I call the mindful thoughts theorem. It's a technical deduction using some first principles that I think you can access through awareness of your own thoughts and properties of your own thoughts. Thoughts are about things. Thoughts can be logically linked to other thoughts, like some thoughts entail other thoughts. And by reflecting on these attributes of thoughts, I make the argument, I'm not going to go through it here, but I make the argument that that thoughts themselves have a nature that can't be derived out of mindless ingredients. And I deduce a theorem that actually says that from these first principles, I think you can access through introspection. So basically what I'm saying is that there's all sorts of construction problems that are very difficult if you start with mindless units of reality. But if you flip the frame, and this is where it can get very exciting, because I have this picture of this airplane, and if it's flying upside down, and you see a blue ocean underneath and a blue sky, above or whatever, you might, the ocean reflects the clouds in the sky. So you might think the ocean is the sky. You might look up, you might get a little confused about like which way is the right way to get the plane going. And I think you can explain a lot starting with mindless foundations. But I really do think that if you flip it and you actually have, no, it's the mind that's foundational, and the mindless things, because I mean, this will sound a little bit weird, but your thoughts are mindless. Okay. Your thoughts don't have a mind. So your thoughts are mindless.
They're produced by a mind, but they're
produced by a mind, but they themselves don't have a mind. Okay. So mental images, they have spatial contents in them. Those spatial contents are mindless, but they're produced by a mind that's capable of producing mental imagery. So if you flip it, if you flip this around, so you've got the mind at the base, then all the mindless things can emerge from mind. And then this, I think, fits very well with our experiences, as well as empirical science. I'm not going to go into that now, but I weave some of that into the book. I'm citing some of the latest studies there. And even there, I try to be careful not to assume a particular interpretation of those studies, because first, it's not my field. I'm not a quantum field theorist, but I'm citing some of the quantum field theorists, and then I'm putting on my analysis hat, my philosopher's hat, and I'm taking what they're saying looks like a consensus of empirical data, and then I'm looking for a way of understanding that makes sense of first-person data as well.
Yeah. So before next question, this is my the last two questions. It sounds like, and again, you said this in your book, and you're saying this. Now it's, if you start with a third person mindless material, you cannot, it's not capable of producing a first person mindful material. But if you start with a first person mindful material, you can produce both first person materials and third person. So it solves the question when you start from the top bottom.
You put that so well. Thank you for putting it that succinctly. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. If you start with the mind first, that gives you a material that can produce both contents of consciousness, as well as we can analyze third-person aspects of reality in terms of the contents of consciousness that are produced. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's taking kind of and we're all materialists in some sense. We're like, we use them, we like them, we are materials in some sense.
Yes.
But it kind of flips the script on a purely materialist account of
the mindless
of the
materialist. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Purely mindless material, where that tends, I mean, I won't say the scientific consensus, but like if you're like, the book we were reading was like, well, biologists can't find us. Like, that's because that's not their purpose, is to find them. It's if it's a material less thing, how will material things find a material less thing?
Exactly. Yeah. Like I was telling you before the show, philosopher of science Alexander Rosenberg, he makes the argument that physics doesn't find thoughts.
Yeah.
And so
if you're a first person, you have thoughts.
That's it. Yeah.
Can't find them.
And so some philosophers make the argument that therefore, if the foundational reality is material, then there would be no thoughts. And then that's the conclusion that they accept, that there are no thoughts. But here it is. I like to just kind of flip that around and say, no, first person, you have access to thoughts. If that's true, if you do have thoughts, then it looks like the fundamental reality is not mindless, but mindful. At least that gives us different resources. I think it can help us solve those problems.
Yeah. Last thing I'll say, then I'll let Nick end it. But it was just so helpful. At the beginning of your book, you talk about like some of the theories, like some of the different ways of accounting for, like, I have thoughts. So how do I account for the fact that I have thoughts if I assume mindless materials are the things that created me? And one of them, and like the only thing maybe I can think of, and we don't have to go too far into this, but is that everything I have is just a result of biological functions and synapses firing and atoms going off. And therefore, like, the things that I'm thinking, I'm not actually thinking, but but then how do I think about them? It's this continual cyclical thought process you go through, where a lot of them will say, well, they just don't exist. It's like, what you're thinking is not actually a thought. It's nobody's quite sure what it is.
Yeah. So there are different theories. Some theories eliminate the thoughts. Others reduce the thoughts to certain states of matter that are not accessible directly through introspection. And so that's where I make the argument that, well, if they're not accessible through introspection, then what is it that I am accessing through introspection?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
you know, I take some time with this, and I want to be careful here because
Yeah.
there's a healthy debate going on, and
Yep.
part of the debate is to work out the different concepts, and I don't want to kind of be overly triumphal in my
Yep.
own present analysis, but I do get very excited about this because it does look to me that the theorists who are going into this field in depth are really seeing
Hmm.
some troubling implications with a completely mindless first materialist
Hmm.
view. And there's a reason why there are so many different philosophers who are coming to the conclusion from the mindless first view that therefore you have no thoughts, or therefore your thoughts are very different than you might think that they are from your first person awareness, or you don't have free will, or you don't have intrinsic value, or you don't have an enduring self. I mean, these are sort of common inferences. And I think this is one of those points in the popular sphere. You know, I was mentioning at the beginning of our time together that in the popular sphere, there's certain impressions. And I think one of the impressions in the popular sphere is that there's not really that much of a problem explaining consciousness in terms of brains getting organized in a certain way. Maybe we don't understand how it works. Maybe it's mysterious, but that's just the nature of the world. It's just mysterious, it just emerges somehow. I feel like that's kind of a sort of a popular impression. And I'm not suggesting that that impression doesn't track a worthy theory of that philosophers are pursuing. It's just that my impression with the philosophers of mind, also reading some scientists who are kind of tipping their spoon into this field as well, but from a more empirical side, that they're more troubled by these construction problems through more analysis. And that's also been my own experience. Like, I wasn't so troubled by them until I started taking all these courses and going deeper into the field. And I can really appreciate the sort of trend to either eliminate thoughts and feelings, or to somehow reduce or analyze them into something that they don't sort of seem to be from the first person perspective. Because, you know, this sort of emergent idea that, well, what you just get sort of this new category of reality that just comes out of this other kind of reality, it is a little bit like ghosts coming out of rocks in a way, you know, or numbers turning into leaves. I mean, it's like, is that mysterious? First of all, why posit more mysteries than we need? You know, if we can have a theory that doesn't have those mysteries. Now people say, well, maybe it has other mysteries, but this is where I make the argument that actually, if you pay attention to your own experiences, you can have knowledge of things that roll away certain mysteries, and you can have a simpler theory that can explain more if you don't have those sort of mindless grains of reality coming first. But one more note, if I could just sort of add this, because I think some people wonder here at this point, how is the brain really related then to consciousness? You know, I'm spending a lot of time talking about how the brain doesn't give you the consciousness, at least not all by itself. But I don't want to give the wrong impression. And I want to even highlight something valuable that Nick was pointing to earlier, which was, you know, the value of your body as well as of your brain. In my book, I talk about this theory of the brain. I get this from a scientist named Kaisik, who develops what he calls the control model of the brain, or he has a version of the control model of the brain. And what the brain does is it helps to facilitate, according to the control model, a certain kind of experiential connection with our environment, so that there's a systematic connection where if I open my eyes, I'll have certain experiences in relation to the environment. And the brain is facilitating that. You could almost think of it like this computer right now that I'm connected to is helping to facilitate my experience of you through the screen. Okay. Doesn't mean that you just are the pixels on the screen. It's like, no, there's something behind those pixels. I was just saying to you that I loved what just happened here, because I was just saying that without the computer connection functioning, I would have no access to you. And then you would just go away. And then the computer stopped functioning and I had no access to you.
Crazy.
But what's so interesting about this is that even while I didn't have the representation of you to interact with anymore, you didn't actually go away. You were actually still existing, even though I couldn't access you. And I think this is a really good analogy for what happens when the brain completely is destroyed and we don't have access to the person anymore. It's not that the person goes away. It's that the person can't access us anymore, because the point of the brain is to give us access to each other in this environment. That's what the brain's doing. It's controlling our interactions in this environment. When the brain is gone, we can't access the person whose brain that belonged to, in the same way, or an analogous way to, if this computer stops working and the screen goes away and you can't see me anymore, you can't access me and I can't access you. I can't even say, hey, I'm still alive. There's life after, the computer dies. I can't even tell you that, because unless I, come back in through another computer, I won't be able to give you the information of my existence. So I just wanted to say this, because it's not that brains don't play a role. It's not that you just exist and you just don't need a brain. No, you actually do need the brain. The brain is facilitating the interactions in this environment.
It mediates maybe the first person to the environment that the first person is in.
That's it. Yeah.
I like it. Cool. Oh, Nick is
sorry, I had to change rooms.
No, do it.
Like my kid was crying. Yeah, and I mean, if I may, and this is just me thinking. So to bring it, kind of circle it back to a Christian apology kind of thing, I'm hoping the audience can kind of see that in order to have us as self-aware, first person aware, even souls, people that are living, for that to even intelligence, for that to even exist, we have to have a creator that is intelligent, a God that actually created us. I mean, there has to be original intelligent source to do all this. It didn't, the self-awareness didn't come out, like create itself out of nowhere. It had to have been created by an intelligent source. So I'm hoping that, I don't know if you guys were thinking that too. I was just hoping that, this would people would kind of pull that together for the existence of even God. But also, I know there's other things that we won't have time to get into, talking about, the soul. I know we don't have time, and I know that's off topic, but I just kind of want to throw that bait out there, breadcrumbs or whatever you want, if you want to pick it up. But
no, it's so good. I just want to say, I mean, I even do touch on those concepts.
Okay. The last chapter is like very, very much on this stuff.
Dang. Yeah, the last chapter, the first part, and then also of the second part too, because I do talk about the sharing of, I use the term self, but you could use the term soul or spirit, that unites us. And it unites us to the ground of all reality. So this brings us back to the existence of God too, because I do make an argument you need the right kind of material.
Even though you don't say exist. God, like if you're reading your work well enough, like you know what you're talking about.
I use the word source. I call it the source substance, and then I begin to describe the attributes it would need to have in order for us to emerge. And lo and behold, it has mentality and some kind of point of consciousness and an intelligence, as you put it, to unify the world. And
that's I think it's really helpful for this conversation, because like you said, you pound it, but you pound it from different aspects. I think helpfully throughout the book, where you say, in order for us to have the things that we have, something has to create us that has those same things, and it can't just have it like at the same level that we do. It has to have it in some supreme way. And so I like, you don't specifically name the Christian God, or talk specifically about his attributes or the image of God, which is some of the stuff that we would agree on, but you ground it in like first person perspective, introspective. Like, what are the things you can know yourself, even if you believe in God, or if you don't? Like, what are the things you can look at yourself? And maybe if you can, like, as we end, maybe to talk to those who are struggling with this, who are like how can I know some of this stuff? Like, how can I look at myself or look at the things around me and say, okay, I have these experiences, or I don't have these experiences, and how on earth can I believe in something that's bigger than me, wider than me, and connects with everything else? Maybe if you can talk to that person versus the Christian who maybe doesn't struggle with some of this stuff.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think sometimes we take for granted the familiar things, the things
Yeah.
that are the most familiar. You know, you wake up in the morning, you have some thoughts, you have a feeling of wanting to go back to sleep. And it's so familiar, you know, that you have a feeling, you know, or that there's just you in existence,
Yeah.
that there's something that can have feelings, that can have thoughts. And one of the things that I really try to do in the book is I try to equip the reader to own their journey, so that instead of me citing authorities and saying, hey, here's what we know, I say, hey, here are some tools that you can use. And I'm going to suggest some things. I'm going to share my journey, but I'm going to invite you to use these tools and test things for yourself. Check it for yourself. Like, you can own this journey. Pay attention to your own thoughts and feelings. Check. I take nothing for granted. So I don't even take for granted that you exist or that you have thoughts or feelings. That's one of the
You start
first
from the
questions
ground
of the
level.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or even that you have any access to these things through introspection. And I talk about, I call this the darkness problem. If you turn off the light of inner awareness, then everything goes dark, and you can't even be aware of reasons to believe that you're in the dark. That is to say, you can't even be aware in your mind of your own reasons to doubt the power of introspection if you turn off the light of introspection, because it's via introspection that you're even aware of the reasons in your mind. Or if you're reading a scientific article and you're analyzing the article is going to talk about people's observations. I make the argument that you can't even know if you're making an observation unless you have some kind of awareness of the experience of making an observation. And that actually involves introspection. And so, you know, if somebody's having doubts, if they're having questions, that's great, because start there, because that means that there's something that that means that things aren't completely dark. That means that you're aware at least of doubts and questions. Now, how in the world did reality give rise to questions? Like, if there was sand blowing in the wind, you know, would it produce a doubt? Would it produce a question? And that's just a question right there to think about. But what I would want to do is just really to encourage people who would be having questions, would be unsure what to believe, where to turn for truth. It's almost like I want to just kind of invite you to trust yourself a little more. Like, you don't have to wait for other people to figure it out. Don't wait for me to tell you what to believe. And if you follow a journey that goes down a path that's different than the path that I've taken, then that's great, because you're paying attention to your powers, your tools to know. You're paying attention to what the light of reason seems to be revealing to you. And in the long term, I think you're going to learn a lot more that way. And in the end, I mean, I do think just the very familiar awareness of yourself, I think that's the clue. Just, if you're really there, like if you are really real, the self-awareness it's not awareness of a brain, because you can be self-aware without even, my kids, they tell me I'm hungry. They didn't even check their brain to know if they're hungry. They just didn't. Okay, so that very familiar self-awareness is so familiar, but it's so significant. And sometimes, like, if you just start there and just think about that, like, just ponder, like, how can I exist? Just ponder that. I think that will actually help you to get insight and wisdom that will be most relevant to you. Just starting with what's clearest to you and following the path of the clear. Where does the clear step lead? Where does it lead? And, you know, my journey is coming from just not knowing what to think about. I remember in college just not knowing what to think about my consciousness, just thinking, you know, maybe if the brain is complicated enough, then it can produce anything. And it wasn't really till I started taking those courses in the philosophy of mind that everything started to turn around for me. And I started to think, well, okay, it looks like there's something more to consciousness. There's something more to self-awareness than spatial aspects of a brain, or even functional aspects of a brain. They're connected. Like I said, the functional aspects of the brain are deeply connected to our interactions with each other in this world. And I'm not claiming or suggesting that I feel like I have it all figured out. I mean, I'm still learning. When I was working on this book, there were parts of the book where I said, here's my latest thinking on this. But then a year later, through my revisions, I was like, actually, that's not my latest thinking on this anymore. And I had to change that line. So, we're all on a journey, and we can learn a lot from each other. And so I guess those are my thoughts about that, really to feel emboldened to test things out for yourself, check things out, use your tools, use that tool of introspection, use the tool of reasoning, and use that scientific method. I have a whole section on the power of the scientific method and utilizing the available empirical data that you're aware of. That will help.
If you have the ability to doubt there's a God, proves in of itself there is a God.
It at least proves that you have doubts. And then from there, you can make the argument that there would be no doubts if there were no God. You could certainly make that argument.
That's true.
Absolutely.
Yeah, true. Yeah, well, Dr. Rasmussen, thank you so much for coming on, for talking through some of this stuff. And I know it can sound like we're going nowhere, but I really do think it is helpful to think through these things, and to have you as a guide through some of our thoughts, and to know if we have thoughts, and we know that we have thoughts, and we know that we're the ones who are thinking them versus somebody else, or observing somebody else. And the fact that we can observe them, and the fact that we can think them, means that we have them. And if we have them, then can something that doesn't have them create us or form us in any sort of way? And I think, like you said at the end of the book, you said, no, I think you have to have a thing that can think in order to create other things that can think. And so we got there in a long way, but I think the journey, like you said, is necessary to get there. You have to go through some of these things. So thanks you for writing this book, and for your research on the mind, and helping us think, not just think better, but I think to think is really helpful. So thanks for coming on.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.